program officers got canned last week. Working for D. We're live. Okay. Hello and welcome to the House Progressive Caucus. It is Tuesday, April 8th, and today we're gonna be focused on the education bill that we anticipate passing out of the House sometime very soon, and in particular, the work that the Ways and Means Committee has been doing to put a proposal on the table for us to vote on regarding the foundation formula and the various weights that'll be used in order to calculate the specific needs of every school. We'll go ahead and start with announcements and then do introductions, and then we'll have a brief conversation about the finance proposal, and then we'll wrap up. There are very few announcements for this week. We're going to be voting probably on 2 to 4 bills this week. It's going to be a pretty light floor. BAA is 2.0 is going to be going back to House Appropriations on Wednesday. And yeah, that's about it. Nothing. It's going to be a pretty quiet week, mostly focused on this bill, actually. And I'll go ahead and start with introductions. I'm Representative Kate Logan. I represent the Chittenden 16 district, which is Central Old North End and Downtown Burlington, and I serve on the Committee on Environment. And I use she, her, they pronouns. And we have a guest.
Jeffrey Wilson from Country, Vermont.
Welcome.
I'm Chloe Tomlinson. I represent Winooski, use she, her pronouns, and sit on the House Transportation Committee.
Great. I'm Colin Robinson. I'm the political director of Vermont NEA.
Courtney Record, I'm with the House Clerk's Office.
Josh Ronsky, I'm the Progressive Party Executive Director and staff support for the House Caucus.
Okay, so let's dive in. We know that, we spent a lot of time talking about the governor's proposal so far this year, and then the education bill that's coming out of the House looks very different than the bill that was introduced by Republicans this session, and Ways and Means has just been doing the work to, I think one of the ideas, the concepts that has been adopted by the House Committee on Ways and Means is a move to a foundation formula. So this would be a pretty significant change in the way that we currently do education finance. I would imagine it would make school budgeting quite a bit easier process on an annual basis. Well, at least in terms of they'd have a box to work with it. And then I think, we'll just, we've asked Colin here to sort of help us think through any remaining questions that we have on that portion of the education proposal. So what's on your mind? I'm really interested, for example, in thinking through the implications of this approach to finance in terms of the impacts it's going to have on local governance. And what are you hearing from folks about taking this approach?
Mm-hmm. So, I think to be fair to everybody, I think we're all still digging into the numbers because I think nobody has been able to sit with these numbers for a long time. The upshot is that given the current timeline and the timeline of the bill, this foundation formula wouldn't be effective until new districts are figured out. So that at the earliest would be July of 2029. So in so much as there needs to be additional eyes on, additional changes, there's time to figure that out. I think also what is very, very clear in as it passed by House Ways and Means today is that it is a number that is grounded in what we understand it actually costs to educate Vermont's kids. The governor's number was woefully inadequate. It didn't actually provide the resources schools need to meet the complex needs of kids. So I think at first glance, the number looks appropriate and reasonable, with the caveat, we still have a lot to learn. And how it's going to impact individual and specific communities really depends upon what the governance structure looks like going forward. So when the Joint Fiscal Office presented this last Thursday in Ways and Means, they presented a very hypothetical math construct, not one that's actually being contemplated by anybody, but they needed something to model off of. And it showed some regions of the state seeing additional resources available to educate their students, and some other regions of the state being basically one for one, kind of steady as it goes, and other regions where they actually would see a decline in resources, even though we're talking about this new foundation formula. And so I think that's where it's going to be really important to understand as this process moves forward, as districts are figured out, how and where actual impacts are going to come in. Because from our perspective at Vermont 88, what we hear from our members every day is there's not extra in our schools right now. You walk in any school, there's no extra anybody. In fact, they're struggling to find people to work in our schools. And so again, at first glance, it seems like a reasonable number, a good place to start. And as the process moves forward into next year with district lines, I think they're going to be, some dialing in that might need to happen. I also think and there's a study on this in the bill that is really, really critical. The current language has an inflator, so the base amount that is in the bill is $15,033 per student. And then there are additional sums for students in poverty, students living in rural places, English language learners. But there's an inflator on that $15,033. And the current language in there ties it to one particular inflator. There's a suggestion and there's a study in the bill to potentially look at some other inflators. Getting that inflator number is really, really, really important, because if you don't have that inflator number correct, recognizing, where costs come in educating our kids and youth are the humans who work with those kids and youth, and making sure that base amount is going up at an appropriate and reasonable amount is going to be really important to ensure we don't systematically begin to de-invest or underfund our education system going forward. So there's an inflator in there right now, which is critical. There's a study to figure out if that is going to be the right inflator to use going forward. And again, given the fact that none of this is operational for some time now, for about 4 years, there's time to sort of figure out those highly impactful details. And the other thing that they're also going to be digging into going forward is special education, and how does that overlay into a foundation construct. Vermont in 2018 moved away from a sort of a reimbursement model. If you think healthcare is kind of fee for service type of construct for special education, these are some of the most vulnerable and students that need the most support to access their education, and moved to a census block grant. There's a whole bunch of reasons why it hasn't move forward in the way that I think was originally envisioned. But with the move to a foundation formula, often special education is funded through a foundation construct as well. So it contemplates and studies moving to, rather than having a block grant for special education going forward, to having weights, additive weights for special education going forward too. So that's another piece of the puzzle that needs to be figured out in the next 4 years, and how impactful that is. I think there's a whole bunch of other changes around taxation, property categories, but I'll pause there and again, your colleagues who are on Ways and Means, I think, are also going to be strong resources for gathering information, but that's just kind of the high level understanding that we have so far, which might not be much different than what you've already heard.
Any questions?
Well, you kind of spoke to this a bit, but I'm just curious, like what NEA's response or concerns are around this proposal so far. I know that there was also the Public Assets Institute proposal that we were jointly working on, and this is, you know, different than that. You know, what your thoughts are, or you know, concerns that we should be looking at in this bill and alternative.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, this is the conversations happening here. You as legislators are going to be asked to vote on it on Thursday and Friday, right? We don't believe that Vermonters asked for a seismic upending of our education system. We have pulled on this. We presented on this previously in caucus. Vermonters are frustrated with how we fund our schools, not that we fund our schools. And so one of the things that I think there's real opportunity for going forward is to move forward with a proposal that provides immediate property tax relief to 50,000 working Vermonters and gets us on a path, perhaps aligning with the foundation formula in July 1, 2029 to eliminate the residential property tax and move to a fully based income system. You know, the Ways and Means proposal updates how income sensitivity works. It moves to this property exemption construct. And I actually think there's I understand why they're going there. And I think it's perhaps a reasonable interim step. However, it's still, we still have some of these, we still have a situation where middle-class Vermonters are paying more of their income than higher income folks.
Yeah,
And
actually,
it doesn't fundamentally crack that nut still.
yeah, no, in fact, it seems like it's actually even more regressive in some ways. I read through testimony the other day from Ways and Means, and it looks like, for example, if you're making $50,000 a year and your home is worth $400,000, your property taxes are going to go up based on this exemption model that they're proposing to adopt.
Yeah, I will admit, because they were trying to figure out some of these, there were some, whenever you're creating policy, especially when you start to zoom in on specific circumstances, income, the value of your house, you get wonky distortions that aren't the desired outcome, right? And I know that they were trying to address as many of those, as you pointed out. And I think that is, and so I actually trust that there might still be some wonkiness that you saw there, and that is not good. And it wasn't for lack of attempting to address it. And I think this actually highlights why eliminating the residential property tax and going to an income-based system makes more sense, because you don't have these kind of wonky little pockets where things get out of whack, right? You're just saying, okay, you make $50,000, you make $100,000, you make $150,000, you make $250,000. You're going to pay a fair share of your income towards our education system.
Right.
And
it's not making enough progress on the overall tax.
I think there's more progress. We would say there's more progress to be made there for sure.
But it also sounds like we have time.
Yes,
to figure
absolutely.
it out.
Yeah. And I also think, you know, looking at the yield bill, which is separate and distinct from this bill, but, you know, the one-time money in there was used to buy down everybody's property taxes. And again, people have their reasons for that. The reality is there are a handful of Vermonters who are still doing really well and have been doing really well for a long time. And I'm not sure that they necessarily need a buy down of their property taxes, but maybe, you know, you could, as the legislative session plows ahead, actually be in a situation where you use some of that one-time money to reduce property taxes for working class and middle class Vermonters, and say, yeah, if you're making $250,000, $300,000 a year, you're going to pay the 5.9%, right? Just what's in there rather than buying it down, and making sure that money's going to the people who really need it, who are really struggling, who do love our public schools, and again, are paying more than their fair share right now. So, I think that there's definitely opportunity, given the timeline in here, to continue those conversations. I do think if you're talking about immediate property tax relief, and directing it to working middle class Vermonters, there is more work to be done on that this year.
Can I ask a question just about, just to clarify that the NEA's position would be to not fund education at all from property taxes.
Our position has long been, we work for public assets on this, is to eliminate the residential property tax. So only about a quarter of our education funding comes from the residential property tax. Another sizable portion, around a quarter or a third, come from other property taxes. So non-commercial, non-homestead. And we think that's still important.
Okay, so you're not saying, yeah, I get it now.
But where it comes in is, as you all know, we have this currently, and if this bill passes, it'll transition to this other construct for how we address low-income folks and their ability to pay their property taxes, right? At the end of the day, and for Steph, you and folks at public assets, when you're trying to make a property tax act like an income tax, is inherently wonky, complex, and difficult to understand, right? If you want to actually have people pay based on your income, just have them based on their income, right? It's not particularly complex. It is in the details, but as a concept, it's pretty intuitive. So
Thanks for clarifying.
yeah,
So it's really, just so if I have to explain it to people, it's that replacing the homestead property tax with income-based income-based tax to fund education, and keeping other forms of property taxes
correct.
in place.
Yeah.
So that would be, okay, so not eliminating all property tax, like I think some states, is it New Hampshire or someone, I can't remember, who has no property tax.
Yeah.
Alright.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, you got it.
So for people who live in their homes, it would just be any municipal property taxes.
Correct.
Yeah.
We're in part of there.
Right.
Like me,
Right.
like, like homestead part would just be treated as income, and there'd be no homestead, wouldn't be this, like you said, complicated
Right.
piece, it would just simplify it, but that we would keep property taxes, and we could certainly look at, you haven't recommended this, but we could look at what those forms of property are.
Right.
I personally would support like different forms of taxes on different kinds of property, for example, a second home.
And that's
Well,
where
that's in this bill.
Yeah, there's like what,
Yeah.
Categories.
there's 3?
Yeah, there's 3.
I thought there was like 9 categories.
They went down from 9.
I didn't see that, but
Yeah.
I liked
Yeah.
the first one, but I don't know.
it was very complicated though.
People
so-
could-
Yeah.
Yep. People can
But
put
let's
that.
break out, is it like
Yeah.
explicitly,
Yes.
basically second or third or whatever homes, you know,
Exactly.
residential,
Non-primary residential.
non-primary residential.
Which is really good, because right now we know that that's causing a crisis for access to affordable housing for working people.
Yeah.
Because, for all the reasons. we know.
Yeah.
I will also say, I think I've heard folks, I haven't talked with our colleagues at public assets about this, but I've heard some legislators in this building say that moving to a foundation formula actually could make it a lot easier to move to a fully income-based education funding system. Because there's the number is known earlier.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you've heard that this construct will allow tax rates to be set earlier,
Yeah.
so folks know that for budgeting purposes, et cetera,
More
et cetera.
predictable. more
Predictable.
Yeah.
And that same construct applies to if you're doing an income-based education funding system as
Yeah.
well.
That's really encouraging because kind of coming into this conversation, looking at the House bill, I think what I've been hearing or kind of the sense was like, oh, are we moving forward with the House bill or are we moving forward with like the public assets? But they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, the House bill could set up the ability to implement the same kind of model in the future.
Yeah, again, I don't want to, I think there are other reasons that folks have pause and concern about the foundation formula. At the end of the day, however it's determined that the resources schools have to meet the needs of youth and kids, you can apply an income-based education funding system to any of those. And some of the sort of hesitancy that I've heard as advocates with public assets and the income-based education funding system, and they move to that, is that you have different income rates tied to local spending, right? And so if you live in Winooski or Burlington or Brattleboro or Barnard, right, your income rate for education would be different because it would be tied to your local spending amount. Conceptually, this is again a feeble brain that I have. Conceptually, if there's a foundation formula with sort of a uniform rate and a number you're solving to, you're not going to have differing income amounts based upon your local community.
So interesting.
Right.
And where do we think we're gonna come out in terms of the ability of a school district to raise additional revenue?
The construct is in there. It's sort of subtle. The term changed a lot. I think it's now at supplemental payment or supplemental spending. And basically allows districts to do it. They have to make the pitch for it. And in order to comply with Brigham, there is a process through which you're aligning the community that's voting for the supplemental payments to not be able to raise more than they would if they were the lowest valued community. And this is a way to get around Brigham, and then the extra funds that would be generated by that would go into a statewide pool that would theoretically start to capitalize the school construction aid fund. And currently in our current education funding system, we have excess spending threshold, which a relatively small number of districts hit. But the construct there is that if you spend more than 118% of the average per pupil amount, you pay $2 to get $1 extra, right? And so this same sort of construct is existing in the supplemental payment, where it costs more to raise that dollar, and you're raising that dollar on a base that is based upon the community with the sort of the lowest, probably gonna use the wrong term, but rainless value, basically taxing capacity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the term.
Yeah. And then, I mean, early on this session, there was a lot of concern that adopting a foundation formula is just a step on the way to, basically complete privatization of our school system or universal choice and things like that. I haven't heard many people fretting about that.
Yeah, I think the details matter, and in this current bill, there are still a lot of details to be figured out.
Yeah.
So you have states across the nation who don't have vouchers and choice and have a foundation formula.
Right.
Right. You have states that do.
Mm-hmm.
We have this historic town tuitioning construct that's been around, for nearly 200 years. And we are where we are now, and how that overlays with our state constitution, the US Constitution, and the current interpretation. And so I do think that where that is going to matter is in the government side, less so than the funding side.
Mm-hmm.
So when the maps are developed and districts are configured, are they fully operating districts or are they not? Right? That piece of the puzzle isn't fully fleshed out yet.
And it won't be until
And
next
it won't
year.
be until next year. And it's in that context that a foundation formula may or may not be more impactful. As I understand it, as currently contemplated in the bill, the full foundation amount plus weighted amount would go with the student if they currently are going to be vouchering to another community. So whereas right now it's a set amount it's an average announced tuition amount. And none of the weighting that currently exists in our taxing capacity structure follows that student. It's a dollar figure of, 17 or 18,000 that goes with that child in a tuition construct. In this, assuming that governance structures either stay the same or echo our current construct, if a student lived in a town where there's no school and they're going to be vouchered, they would get the 1533 plus any applicable weights for them based upon their other categories that might go with them. So the other big missing puzzle piece in all this is CTE. And that is another thing that's going to be addressed in theory next year. Because how does CTE fits in is contingent upon any new or future district lines that may or may not materialize.
Right.
Finally, I will say all of this, the foundation formula part of this can be done without any redistricting comment, right? So this,
And there do seem to be some very tangible benefits to us of going that direction.
yeah.
The stability and predictability basis.
Right. Yeah. And so I think everybody's trying to understand the specifics of how these numbers are going to work. And I think I have not seen, you all as legislators might have access to it from JFO, but sort of district by district, this the over under. Because I do think that there are some districts where the foundation formula is going to be really positive. Right. And I think there might be some other districts that it's going to be challenging, and where it gets tricky is some of those districts where it might be challenging are districts that are already operating at quote unquote scale and provide a robust and fulsome education to their students. And so we don't want to be in a situation where we're leveling down or leveling up. Right. And I haven't seen enough analysis to understand district by district impact of this specific number, other than understanding kind of that broad regional analysis that JFO sort of gave a general notion of, which had, as I said, like Addison County and Chipping County regions perhaps seeing it tick down, Bennington County seeing it tick up, Washington County, I think, sort of being kind of your 1-to-1,
But certain schools.
Right.
Yeah. Better. Yeah.
And then final missing puzzle piece in all this bill 454 does sort of restart a school construction aid concept and program, but it doesn't fund it. And I think one critical question when you start talking about what any district reconfiguration, and especially when you start talking about anything related to class sizes, school size, all those things, our school infrastructure has $6 to $9 billion, B with a B, in need. And even if there was a desire for some schools to come together or something like that, whether it's decided at the local level or some other mechanism, the practical reality is the building infrastructure might not exist.
Right.
So you might not be able to meet some of the things that are hoped for or desired in this without also addressing and funding school construction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Well, I was also just smiling because another thing that doesn't appear to be addressed at all is transportation. And like without knowing the districts, there's a lot of open questions around what transportation needs will look like and if we have the capacity to deliver on those needs and what that looks like in reality for students. So it'll be interesting to see how the district conversations play out. And notable that we can move forward with the foundation formula and some of these changes that are beneficial without making massive changes to our districts. So grateful that there will be more additional work to look at those options.
Me too. And the fiscal notes.
Yeah. Some kind of
some rationale, the economic rationale behind all this, which I just
and I think the two final points I would just leave you all with is one is do no harm because no one's intention is to cause harm, but if we don't get this right, it could be
Yeah.
seismically impactful
Yeah.
for generations to come.
But right now, it doesn't sound like you're sounding the alarm at this point.
At this particular moment, it doesn't seem to be that. And I think one thing that kind of one of the things that was most jarring and concerning about the governor's proposal was that it was rushed. It was an unrealistic concept that didn't seem to center kids, and wasn't based in any reality that currently existed or even seemed feasible to exist in the future. And so what this proposal is looking at is, again, details matter significantly, but at least on a very basic level, the timeline is logical.
Yeah. Yeah, reasonable.
And recognizing that we can't just flip the switch on something, flip the table and do everything differently. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
I also just flag, how obviously our members have local unions in every school district where they bargain with their employers.
Right.
Central premise of collective bargaining is you do that with your employer.
Yeah.
It works well. It has for over 50 years in Vermont. It's a very mature collective bargaining statute. And in so much as there are future district configurations that look different than they exist now, having statutory language to ensure seamless transitions for negotiations and collective bargaining is going to be really important. That language existed in Act 46 during that kind of construct that created voluntary mergers. And so the language is there, and it was hard work. There was a bump or two, but for the most part, that actually worked relatively smoothly. So that none of that is in here, and it doesn't need to be in here.
But next year.
Unless there's a conversation about some district.
Yeah.
Specific district reconfiguration, that will be a very, very, very critical part of making sure educators are able to have a voice in the future of their schools they work in, and how best they're able to meet the needs of their students.
Yeah.
So
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful. No, thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Do you have any further questions right now, Chloe? Okay, it's nice to know that you're not sounding the same alarm that we were hearing at the beginning of the session, that this seems like a reasonable step to take at this point. And that we all need a lot more information before we know what and pretend to know what the impact is going to be. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Colin.
yeah,
Appreciate it. Okay, we'll wrap up. I'm gonna run off and prep for the next thing. Yeah, we'll go ahead and end there. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Feel free, the ledger update is, at least me and Eva have updated our sections.
Thank you.
That's in there.
Thanks. Really appreciate that.
Yep.
Need to, okay. Appreciate that. I'll take a look and I'll let you know if I have any questions.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap up there.